there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and
Is it the TV? There again.
yeah. Again, when we get up a little bit closer. So there's
Yeah, it's out of the speakers. It's really loud.
through those gates, and somewhere back there, and
No, it's the laptop. That's all it is.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Turn it up one laptop. Let me just turn it down one laptop. And dysfunction of which one?
Because it's not playing it back very smooth either.
I think as long as it plays fine on the live stream, doesn't matter about us having it down too.
I don't know if this is getting switched in.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
I mean, I can pull back so that we can see the monitor,
Mhm.
but I don't think we're not sending it downstairs.
I'm gonna go to 14.
This is what I thought.
Go to 14.
Well, so I just checked with Scott. This first row of chairs, none of the chairs are in the shot because I was gonna pull it back.
Just because it looks so empty.
Yeah. I just.
Right.
I'm not sure.
You can see. You can come see the shop. Too.
yeah. Again, when we get up a little bit closer. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
I just feel bad for those people.
How's this? What's the audio?
Oh, playback was better too.
Oh, there's supposed to be a free going on. Mark, I have an idea. Is there another red? There might be a phasing thing going on. It has to happen. It's unlikely, but it's
The
possible.
lighting here looks nice. Is it changed? Is it different?
Yeah, they did change the lighting.
Yes.
Yeah, we put.
It's nice.
Yeah, it looks very nice.
Well, we said if anybody noticed, we were gonna turn them on. And you noticed, so we gotta turn them off.
What? No, just the color of the light is the same.
Yeah, again, when we get up a little bit closer. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
Sorry.
You can buy different colors and shades.
Well, the colors are pretty.
Well,
Kind of pink.
well, it's actually Dave. It's the color of your incandescent lights. So like a table lamp or whatever. That's 3,200 degrees. Most of them are. I think there's a few lamps that are 3,000 degrees.
Yeah, again, when we get up a little bit closer. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
3,200 degree
Did he
light.
have his
And I look up here and I see
radio
how
playing at
green
the
it
same
is.
time? Is
You
that what I
see
heard?
how
Yeah.
green
Yeah.
fluorescent light is inherently green.
Which makes everyone look sick.
Yeah.
But people look pretty in that light. That's what I'm like that in my house. My
Unless they're a bald head black guy. No,
Well, we can't help
And now
that.
you
can't
can,
help that. Okay. 1, 2, hey, check, check, check.
with LED light, you can change the color temperature.
So, Julie, we have Andre and
What's
Penny.
funny is when I plugged
Anybody
it up
else
to
speaking?
my phone, it actually worked.
Well,
Maybe
Eddie
Phil?
is gonna
Number
be.
14
No, I mean
actually
like
worked.
here.
Not very loud. but
Yeah,
still
I
worked.
think we can take one on.
I mean, number 15
But
actually
I
worked.
think Bill might end up having to step in.
Yeah. Well, so then that's still three, right?
Uh-huh.
Ciao, amigo. Ciao. Hasta la pasta. You moving to the other one?
Yeah, for right now, just wanna.
Just see if it works.
Oops, hit the wrong thing.
Yeah, you escape. Just escape out.
Well, I'm
Try
here
to go
now.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah, again, when we get up a little bit closer. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
Yeah, he had his radio playing. Did you hear it?
Mm.
Let me set this to where it'll automatically launch.
All right, now, is your inclination for me to leave this here just in case?
Nope.
Or
Yeah, jam when we get up a little bit further. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and
We're not, yeah, we're not. Yes, we would have either needed the. I mean, the files for this are down there, but we're not set ready to.
I should have found out if we left it.
I'll just pull a
When he's
building
here,
between. I'll go out and try to
that
hold the
introduces
monitor
the
and
video.
play the video,
The next tab actually goes to the
but
next
they won't
slide.
give me the slides either.
Hey, Mark.
Tell him.
yeah, jam when we get up a little.
Let me show you this. It works right out the thing here. I set it so that to launch the video, like there's a video. Boom, hit it again and it launches.
Oh, okay.
Just like you like, so somebody.
Yeah, jam when we get up a little bit further. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
What's really cool is the way it finishes up, comes forward. That's got Scotty written all over it. Okay. And then it, so, boom, boom. And some you can stop it there and say we've actually got a video, da da da.
Power cable.
All the slides.
Yeah, jam when we get up a little bit further. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
Yeah, I'm sure. I
Yeah,
mean,
he emailed, because he
no
emailed me.
matter how much we put in the things, I'm sure it'll be like, and I lose him. I
You good?
No, 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 we don't. When I asked him, I was like, "Is there anything else?" He
Thank you,
emailed
Rich.
me back saying,
Thank you.
I didn't do it.
Thank you, Rich.
Thanks, Ram.
"Thank you, Grandma."
Lindsay, I'm so desperate. His name was E today.
Don't think
I
I
know. I
didn't
looked at that.
notice.
I started to send it back. I said, no, I'm gonna apologize to her in person. So my
Quite
apologies.
all right.
I looked at. it, I said, that's not her name, Jerome.
I
Okay.
knew you knew. Stuff happens.
They're like, Lindsay. Who the hell is Lindsay?
Sit right here and block the view.
Yeah, how's it look with people in the seats?
You won't be able to see anybody sitting at the table. All you see is the back of your head and the tops
I
and the
hear
tops
shoved.
tops of theirs.
No, I can get good clean singles on table, but
Cool.
hopefully nobody's going to be sitting at the table talking because there ain't microphones on that
Yeah,
table.
no mic on the table. You need to talk to the podium.
Do we have
It's on.
we have two handhelds.
Okay.
Yep.
Should I put one on the table just in case?
And then you're gonna
And
make them
then-
sit there. Somebody
Or
we need to call this person that's gonna be on the phone?
Eddie, Eddie is gonna be in his car.
Okay, so here's what's gonna happen, yeah, here's what's gonna happen. He is to the court, he's gonna be at the courthouse at 2 filing papers. So he's going to let me, he's gonna send me a text when he's in his car and then we'll dial him.
Okay, during the event? So we have no way of testing it, to make sure he can hear us and we can hear him.
No, it's a cell phone.
Okey-doke.
How about Kathy? She might call, we don't know. She's gonna listen to you.
We set this up as one person only on the phone.
Right, yeah.
So Kathy can't call.
No, she's not.
Bill,
Do you wanna take a look through the slides?
Slides fine.
Anybody going to the casino tonight?
Feel money.
Feeling lucky?
Wanna come to a festival?
I think I have to.
Might be the only one sitting here. You wanna see him? You've already seen him, but you
No,
wanna
I
see
just
him
wanted to
again?
make sure that, oh, Joanne, thank you.
Somebody better come check
Bill's making
what
money.
I want.
I didn't realize those were for him.
There's a new place, we're gonna find a place. Okay,
Oh, we gotta find him.
And, so we've got 2-track, we're still trying to get the appeal. And the second, the new track, we're gonna discuss today is how to get the release.
Yeah, when we get up a little bit. So there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and
Yeah, I did. Did you sign it? I did not. I wasn't sure. I didn't know.
No,
But
it's okay.
great.
Cool.
That's it?
You want these on the table?
Sure. Yeah.
Julie, put the 15 copies of the release. Okay, great, thanks. Sorry.
Sure.
Just to understand it, it's gonna take it. I was hoping to have a big announcement that we freed them, and then you have a half a month.
Well, it's also a primary election day in Texas, technically.
Oh, sure.
Let me go forward this
Is there a nice press release that explains all this stuff?
out front.
Oh.
Yep.
Did you sign in?
Do you have the phone number?
No, Julie's dialing it, or somebody's dialing it.
Hey, Molly. How are you? Good. Are you here for this?
I am. I'm here to support you guys and see what's going on. Danny's gonna be on as well.
Oh, good. Good. Good.
I need to
Oh,
go to
Andre's
church.
right. Hi. How are you? Hi, Gutierrezes. It's nice to meet you. Thank you for your nice
So we have a new statement behind the
I think I've passed by you several times. I feel like
Yes.
we met ages ago, but we've been on emails
Summer.
together, and of course, how's everything going?
Good. How are
Nice
you?
to see you.
Nice to see
You're
you.
still with Reporters Without Borders,
Yeah, I just got a permanent position there. So I was interning over the summer and now I'm here for good.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Congratulations. I hope we'll see you around in the middle of
I'll sit here.
wherever you want.
Let me sit in the middle.
Would you like some water?
I would appreciate it, yes. I could just
Andre?
how long?
How long an hour?
Okay, no problem. I have an assignment.
Oh, yeah, what? What?
I don't know, I got drafted to do this for the wire, but here, you can do it.
I'm not doing it for the wire. I'm here for supporting the board member, and then I need to go back to work.
Yes,
But I'm glad you're covering for the wire.
I was looking for a nice press release.
There is a press release. There should be. Was there a press release outside?
I got this, that's not the press, that is not,
That's not the press release.
I didn't see one out there.
Ask Julie. Shall I start?
You wanna, as soon as she's
Go
downstairs,
to
just
the
heard
press release. You didn't see the press
noises
release.
from up here.
Okay.
I didn't hear noises from back there. How you guys
No.
doing?
Sit here.
I didn't realize you were here.
You don't have to.
Who's shaking?
Okay.
I'm shaking on it
I
too.
can, if it helps.
It's fine.
It's
But if you're not
busy.
sitting here,
Get ready to travel again.
Yeah, thank you.
Where you going?
And are we waiting for anything in particular?
Enjoying yourself yet?
Always. Always. It's fun. I mean, as you know, it's a whirlwind, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But
I was in.
Make sure you have fun with it.
I am. I mean, there are neat things that are coming up, and I'm meeting neat people. It's just, there are, there's a lot of stuff going on.
It can overwhelm you, but you're only doing it because it's
For
fun.
right, right. And we wouldn't be doing it otherwise.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you walk away from it at the end, you say, that was the best thing I could have ever done.
Was like about
Okay, that's the goal.
That's the goal.
That's the goal. That's the goal.
40 performers. So
We should get started.
aerialists.
That sounds really amazing.
Yeah, it was.
And so what did you do?
I played. I was the MC.
God, that's fabulous. Oh my God, is it you? That's crazy. What a great photo. Can we see? Oh my God, I love that. That should be like your profile photo on everything ever for the rest of your life. That's so great. Hey, thank you for listening. Oh yeah. Much better. Wow.
But not just you can see it. Crazy epic stuff.
When did that happen? No, I've been talking about this for years. Right.
We did lights up in there, and it happened.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Boy, you are like a powerful. There, how are you? How are you? Yes, very cool. Thanks for sharing. I really appreciate
It
it.
makes it so much better.
Yeah. It's a lot for you.
Guess what? The minute you
It's like even if
actually is near because
believe it or not, it was tough because it was hard to like get shots.
Are we on now?
There, I would imagine really, really
Probably kill trees.
Now, when I asked about this at the front desk, I said, we're not doing that this time. So when I tried to look at my email, I was able to check. So, yes, yes.
So we're just going to start in about 2 minutes. Just see if anybody else comes in, and then we'll get started. I'm good. How are you?
Okay, since it's just us here,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Are we good to go? All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Andrea Edney. I am the 111th president of the National Press Club, the place where news happens, and the world's leading professional organization for journalists. We are here today to discuss some new developments in the case of Emilio Gutierrez. Many of you who are here in this room with us today and those of you who are joining us online are familiar with this case, but for those of you who are unfamiliar, let me give you a broad outline. Emilio Gutierrez is the National Press Club and the National Press Club Journalism Institute's 2017 John P. Aubuchon Press Freedom Award winner. And he was here speaking in the club less than a month before he was swept up at a routine asylum check-in in Texas. Emilio gave a great speech here on behalf of Mexican journalists. Many of you heard his inspiring comments. And on December 7th, he was detained, and he has been held in detention in El Paso since then, so for 3 months. I'd like to call everybody's attention to the change.org petition. It's change.org/free Emilio. If you have not already signed it, please go to change.org and add your signature. We have over 99,000 signatures on the petition now. We are trying to get to more than 100,000. I have a statement here from Beto O'Rourke, the congressman representing El Paso, where Emilio is being detained. He says, "Our country's asylum laws were designed to provide refuge to brave individuals like Emilio, who have risked their lives in pursuit of the truth in countries dangerous for reporters. I strongly support the legal efforts to ensure that Emilio and Oscar can return to their home. I remain optimistic that the Board of Immigration Appeals will recognize the grave threat that persists for journalists in Mexico. Meanwhile, ICE has the discretion to release Emilio and Oscar. They pose no flight risk pending the process at BIA. We cannot continue to stand for freedom of the press abroad when we do not stand for those same freedoms here at home." I would like to reiterate that Emilio came to this country legally seeking asylum after receiving death threats in his own country. He had reported on corruption in the Mexican military and feared for his life after receiving these threats, came to the United States and sought asylum. His asylum petition was denied, and we are currently pending the appeal for that. Now, one of the new developments in the case today is that we are taking a two-pronged approach in Emilio's case. I'd like to introduce to you Penny Venetis, who is a professor at Rutgers University, and she, working with Emilio's attorney Eduardo Beckett, have prepared a writ of habeas corpus to release Emilio from detention. Penny, would you be able to come discuss that writ, tell us a little bit about what that means and what that means for Emilio's case?
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you so much for
Would you like to come to the podium? Penny will be taking questions as well afterwards, so if you have questions, get ready to ask.
So hi everybody, thanks for coming. And thanks to the Press Club for supporting Emilio and Oscar so zealously. My students at Rutgers Law School and I were taken by Emilio's story as soon as we heard it. And that's because in the United States, you can't be thrown into jail if you haven't done anything wrong. And that really is exactly what has happened with Emilio and Oscar. Emilio, as you just heard, and you may have attended the dinner or heard about the award, he is a very, very brave journalist who risked his life for many years reporting on corruption in the Mexican government and the Mexican military. And he's in the United States because he can't live in Mexico any longer. He leads a very modest and simple life now, operating a food truck. But he is a journalist at heart, and he has reported about abuses that the world otherwise would not know about. He has been here, I want to just sort of emphasize that he has been here for almost 10 years. And as an asylum seeker, one is protected during the application and the entire process when the government is actually considering one's application. So he's done nothing wrong. He's done nothing wrong in being here, and he's done nothing wrong in applying for asylum. And he had a work permit, so he hasn't been detained for 9 years. He has been living amongst us, and he is among us. He lives in New Mexico, and he has a food truck. His son went to college for a few years and works in the food industry as well. And they have work permits, they have Social Security cards, so he really has done absolutely nothing wrong. The current administration, however, has really turned up the volume on its, not only on its anti-immigrant rhetoric, but also on actions that it's taking towards immigrants who have done nothing wrong. So Emilio and Oscar went in for their checkup, which happens every few months with Immigration Services, and they literally were snatched and put into a van, and the van started driving them from El Paso to Juarez, Mexico, which is across the bridge. So they were, it's almost as if it was an abduction. So they're driving, and then their lawyer on the ground, their immigration attorney, managed to get an emergency stay of deportation, where the appeals board of the Immigration Services said, no, we're considering this case, they cannot be deported. And instead of releasing them so they can go back to their lives, they actually put them in jail, and they've been in jail for 3 months now. Again, they were shuttled from jail to jail, not given beds, slept on the cold floor. So it's really taken a toll on them. Their home has been broken into, their belongings have been stolen. So that's their story. It's a real tragedy that someone who should be celebrated as a hero is actually someone who is treated like a criminal, who has absolutely sort of no protection at this point, except for us and you, the press. As I said in my very first sentence, you can't just take someone who's done nothing wrong and throw them in jail. It just can't happen. And we are filing a petition for, it's called habeas corpus, which means literally in Latin, you have the body. And it's one of the oldest writs that exists in legal history, stemming back to Old England, the 13th century. And basically, it is asking a judge to review the detention of individuals who their advocates believe are being detained unlawfully. And we believe that both Emilio and Oscar are being detained unlawfully. And we believe in particular that several provisions of the US Constitution are being violated by their detention, and as well as international law. So I'll talk about the constitutional provisions first. We believe that Emilio and Oscar have been targeted because they are Mexican. It's as simple as that. We have a president who, throughout his entire campaign and since he's been in office, vilifies Mexicans on almost a daily basis, calling them rapists, calling them criminals, and sort of rousing crowds by talking about having Mexico pay for a wall at the border. We are using these statements to show that there is an anti-Mexican bias throughout the administration, particularly in the immigration process, and that is borne out by the fact that that detentions of Mexicans have increased. Sanctuary cities that have large Mexican populations are being threatened to have their funding cut by the administration. An appeals court, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, held just 2 weeks ago in the third Muslim ban case that the president's own words of hatred or own words of vilification of particular ethnic groups, in that case Muslims, are indications of governmental policy. And we believe that just as is the case with Muslims, the same applies with Mexicans like Emilio and Oscar, that the president's personal animosity towards Mexicans and Mexico is really fueling the administration's immigration policies. And that is very, very problematic, and it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution that requires fairness in the administration of governmental duties. What's really quite something is that along this lines of detaining and targeting Mexicans is that Mexico is really a dangerous place for journalists. In the past year, nearly 20 journalists have been murdered for doing their jobs, for doing investigative reporting. And there was a document that was filed in Emilio's asylum case before the Board of Immigration Appeals by Scott Busby of the State Department, and these documents should be accessible online, stating that Mexico is a dangerous place for journalists, and other than war zones, it is the most dangerous country in the world for Mexican journalists, for journalists, period. So you have one arm of the government who is detaining Mexicans, and you have another arm of the government saying, look, there is real fear of persecution here. This guy's going to be killed if he's sent back to the border and given to the Mexican authorities. And as I said earlier, that's exactly what happened. He was being driven literally across the border. So not only is Emilio and Oscar's detention a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, but we also believe it's a violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of the press. We believe that Emilio and Oscar are being targeted because Emilio is a reporter. And you all know how the president feels about reporters, how he during his campaign made people sit in pens, reporters sit in pens, having the crowds jeer at reporters, and there were reports by journalists saying that they were afraid of being physically accosted by people who attended these rallies. He's made statements, anti-journalist statements like, I don't want to kill them, but I hate them. Again, Emilio and the president's treatment of Jorge Ramos, physically ejecting him from a news conference for asking a legitimate question about immigration policy, which is really sort of the most divisive and important issues of our day. He really didn't do that with anyone else. And like Emilio, Jorge Ramos is Mexican-American, and a journalist. So Emilio has the great misfortune of being in belonging to two categories that the president has vilified and continues to vilify. We also believe that Emilio has been targeted and jailed because of statements that he's made about immigration policies in the United States. He has been a law-abiding citizen and a law-abiding resident in this country, and he has commented, like the rest of us, on the need to fix a broken immigration system. He has done this in a very respectful way. He's done it in talking about the asylum process, which takes a very, very long time. And he has not articulated anything that anyone in this room has also not articulated about the need to come up with a better way to deal with immigration, particularly as it applies to people who cannot return to their countries because they're in danger. So he made a very passionate speech here when he received his award, and we believe that those comments actually added to his interest to the administration as someone who needs to be gotten rid of. There was a report that was issued just this past month that actually discusses the administration's tactics of detaining immigrants, particularly at the Mexican border, and having them choose between staying in jail for no reason and being deported, and that's really a false choice. And in this case, Emilio and Oscar really can't choose to be deported because their lives are in danger. We also believe that in addition to the 14th Amendment and the First Amendment, that Emilio and Oscar's due process rights guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment are also being violated. And there's a lot of case law. You have the brief that we wrote and that is being filed today, that, there's a system, there's a way to deal with immigrants. And for asylum seekers in particular, the Immigration Services, ICE, has said that they can be paroled unless they are flight risk or they pose some sort of danger. And here, that's not the case. Emilio and Oscar lead very quiet lives in their community where they're beloved, and there's actually support groups that have been formed, Friends of Emilio, and the group is fairly large, has journalists and lawyers as members, and they try to spread the word about immigration law and the asylum process. So ICE didn't follow its own rules and regulations in dealing with Emilio and Oscar. The other thing is there was a recent case in New York City that we also worked on just 2 weeks ago. And in that case, it was an immigrant who had been detained, again, snatched from his life without any sort of warning, someone who had been here for a long time. And in that case, even though that person actually, unlike Emilio, that person did have a criminal record, the court said it is a due process violation to just detain someone who has become part of the fabric of our country and a member of so many different communities, that you can't just take someone and throw them in jail, that you have a substantive due process right in being able to know what's going to happen to you. And she actually let this person out of immigration detention. And again, that case is different from this one, but the concept is the same, which is that you can't just, take someone who expects to have a routine visit and throw them in a van and try to drive them across the border, and then when it's stopped, just keep them in jail for 3 months. So those are the policies, domestic laws that we believe have been violated, and our brief goes into quite some detail talking about the international laws that we also believe have been violated, that really mirror the constitutional provisions that I just spoke about. And those are supported by international law in international instruments that the U.S. has ratified. And finally, the brief in the last section talks about how the U.S. every year calls to task countries for doing exactly what the U.S. is doing to Emilio and Oscar. We give some salient examples of the State Department reports, country reports that are issued every year where the U.S. evaluates the human rights records of every country on the planet. And in last year's report, there are the U.S. criticizes France and England and Ireland for detaining asylum seekers, for not treating asylum seekers properly, for detaining journalists, for jailing people who speak out. This is all around the world, who speak out against governmental policies in the same way that Emilio has spoken out against immigration policies that don't work. So sort of on the one hand, we sort of hold ourselves out as the beacon of justice and freedom, even towards immigrants and asylum seekers in issuing the country reports. And on the other hand, you have people like Emilio and Oscar in jail for 3 months for absolutely no reason. So we laid those cases out for you. And we also pointed out how the United States grants political asylum to people like Emilio and Oscar. So they have a strong case. They have a fantastic immigration lawyer in Texas who's working with them. And the State Department's Scott Busby letter really shows that it is very, very dangerous for them to go back. So we are hoping to have the corpi of Emilio and Oscar released from jail. We filed papers today in Texas. We asked for an emergency hearing, so I may be going from D.C. to Texas to argue the case. And we are hoping that they're going to be released because all the law that's discussed in detail in the brief really supports their being released and not being detained. So I'll take questions if anyone has any. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about how the Supreme Court decision saying that immigrants were not entitled to a detention hearing affects this case?
So you're talking about the Jennings case that just came down, sort of a few days ago. And, of course, I was not happy to see the Jennings decision as we were trying to put these papers together. But actually, the Jennings decision doesn't really impact this case at all because what Jennings did is Jennings said to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that, look, you can't read into the immigration laws something that isn't there. You can't read into it that you have to have some sort of a hearing every 6 months for people who are detained at the border, okay? So Emilio has been out for nearly 10 years, and Oscar. You can't, so you can't read that into the statute. And it actually, the court sent it back to the Ninth Circuit to say, I want you to analyze the constitutional principles. Does this detention without a hearing, periodic hearing, violate constitutional law? So the court sent it back to determine what we lay out in this in the brief that you have that other courts have commented on already. So the Ninth Circuit may not have done that, but other courts around the country have, and we discussed those opinions, and they resoundingly have said you can't just take someone and throw them in jail if they've done nothing wrong. It's a very simple concept. I mean, every 2-year-old knows that. So again, I mean, the Jennings decision is something that was not celebrated by advocates of immigrants, but at the same time, it was incredibly narrow. And the Ninth Circuit, we believe, will come back to say, right, this violates the Constitution, so you have to come up with some sort of system. Yes?
It's been shown that the longer...
Wait for the mic, please.
Yes. It's been shown that the longer an asylum seeker stays in a detention center in the United States, the more probable it is that they will throw in the towel.
Right, that they will voluntarily be deported, because
Right.
it stinks to be in jail.
Right. Therefore, just what exactly are the conditions in the El Paso detention center?
So Emilio, so you're right, and I talked about a report that was just issued in the past month talking about how the immigrants who are being detained have this false choice of, do I stay in jail, or do I repatriate myself? And as I said, Emilio doesn't have that option. Emilio and Oscar, they just don't. He was just evaluated by a psychologist in the past week who determined that he showed signs of PTSD and major depressive disorder. He has other health problems that are not being attended to. I'm not a doctor, but from what reports that have been given by Emilio and his attorney, immigration attorney Ed Beckett. So he's not happy. He is, it's really impacting him physically and medically to remain detained.
Is this detention center contracted out to some private corporation? And if so, who? And what's to prevent the people in this audience from sticking their nose into the detention center and finding out whether it's a Trump hotel?
You should go out and do that. I don't know if it's actually a private company. That's a good question. I brought a lawsuit 20 years ago against a private corporation that was detaining immigrants, and it was a landmark case that held that immigrants, asylum seekers in detention, can actually sue under international law to have their human rights protected. So, and that was a private company. So I don't know if it's a a private company and who owns it. I think Ed Beckett, who's on the ground, might be able to answer that question.
Could may we pass the mic to our executive director, Bill McCarron, who is also here with us
Sure.
today? Just for a
So
moment.
I think we do know the name of the company. We're looking for it. It is a private company that does own it, and this facility was greatly expanded to accommodate, what they think is going to be a growth industry, unfortunately, in this. The conditions, I would just say that it's crowded. We know this because the week prior to our visit, they had released 30 people back into the community on, humanitarian parole or something like that. There were still yes. Emilio had the complaints that prisoners will have. He complained about the food, probably with a lot of good reason. He complained it was hard to communicate. For a while, he was having trouble getting access to his medicine. He was first in one facility, then moved to another, the one he's in now. Some stuff didn't catch up with him. So these are not unusual problems in any kind of incarceration or situation. I'm not sure. I think we might have some video of what it looks like in this place. We were driving around there for a little while. There's razor wire all over the place. It looks more like a military base than when we say jail. We all have a concept.
Yeah, so there's the barracks back there somewhere. Emilio and his son are detained through those gates, and somewhere back there, and.
Okay, thank you. Crystal White and Julie Shu of the Journalism Institute have just pulled up this information. So the facility is owned by the federal government, but managed by something called Doyon Group. Government group. It's DOYONGOV. Yeah. This is their URL, so let's read it out. Sorry. It's Doyon, DOYON, Government Group. That's the name of the company. Doyon Government Group. Looks like they have a division called Doyon Logistics Services. And they have a Native American, interestingly, a Native American symbol as their. Okay, it might be looks like it might be what's called a native corporation, so it's based out of Alaska. That can be just the ownership, right? Headquarters in Washington State, sorry. Yeah. Anyway, Doyon, sorry. Who's got this? Got that.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, well, I had a question
Yeah.
if nobody else has a question. Professor, go ahead.
Wait for the mic.
The submission by the State Department clarifying the position of journalists in Mexico, will that be entered as well into the Board of Appeals hearing?
It already has. The government
Okay.
submitted it on its own.
If you look at the date of the original rejection of asylum, there have been many reports written after it from HOO here in Washington, D.C. There have been many, many reports, including a Swedish report that I have myself. Will they also be entered into evidence?
So Ed Beckett, who is Emilio's immigration attorney, who is doing a really terrific job, he is gathering all the materials. And perhaps after this press conference, I can speak with you and you can give me a list of documents that you think should be included, and we're happy to take a look at them. But it's not the only the. Okay, great.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. So just on that same note, we found out about this because the government submitted this letter to BIA, and BIA sent it back to Eddie saying, this is now part of your case. And that's when we decided to make it part of the, or Penny decided to make it part of the habeas case. And I just wanted to say about that, you know, those of us, you know, who have been in a federal courtroom when the judge asks, who here speaks for the United States of America? Thank God somebody is finally speaking for the United States of America. Mr. Busby, who stood up here and issued this statement, is the first person who's acting, you know, like we'd like to see our government act in this case, and following the law. And he's, a man of considerable chutzpah, I would say. It'd be interesting what's going on.
It's a legal
back there.
term, right?
Yeah.
May I just add to that really very quickly? The State Department letter that we've been referencing also directly contradicts some of the statements made by the judge when he denied Emilio's asylum in July. So the immigration judge said, and I quote, "The court cannot conclude that it is more likely than not the respondent will be tortured on his return to Mexico." He also said that he finds it implausible, quote unquote, that Emilio could be surrounded by armed military officials without a significant public reaction. And I would point out that in the letter from the State Department, Mr. Busby cites a Reporters Without Borders report that concluded in 2017 that a body set up by the Mexican federal government, the body is called the Special Prosecutor's Office for Crimes Against Freedom of Expression. That entity was set up to investigate crimes against journalists and bring those cases to court. But the Reporters Without Borders investigation concludes that this entity lacks the personnel, funding, and the political will to deal effectively with these cases. And according to the same report, only 10% of the cases involving crimes against journalists have resulted in convictions in Mexico. So this directly contradicts this. Thank you, Professor 2000 filed. So that directly contradicts some of the statements made during the denial of Emilio's asylum last year.
Yeah, and again, the case is on appeal, and the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals, issued an emergency stay of deportation. So you really have, it's almost like the Keystone Cops, but with very real consequences. No one's laughing here.
That's right. Do we have, I see another question.
Can you talk about the medical information that's in this that we mentioned in the brief?
Well, there's an evaluation that was done, as I said, by a psychologist who found that this is really impacting Emilio significantly and causing PTSD and major depressive disorder, and again, as Bill said, also sort of other physical ailments like that come from not getting one's medication. So. They've slept on concrete floors. They've been shuttled around. Initially, they were driven 90 miles away from their communities in El Paso and Las Cruces, New Mexico. They were taken 90 miles away. Why? I mean, there's really no reason to do that other than I'm not sure. I know that he was having problems getting his medication, the medication, and maybe Bill can speak to that. But he really, I know that when I spoke to him, he told me that he was getting, sort of Tylenol and was given a lot of over-the-counter drugs that really did not seem to me as a non-doctor appropriate for what what he needed.
So, Mark, I can use this, right? So what's interesting about this is that so far, aside from Eddie visiting him or somebody like me visiting him, so all the information about Emilio's health has been, anecdotal and non-professional, and so we were hearing the anecdotal stuff and raising it with people at the facility. Hey, he's complaining about this or that, and so he's had these sort of cursory health reviews that occur in the facility. But what has happened here, and what's part of the foundation documents for in this case, is that Kathy Kiley was one of our folks at the Journalism Institute was speaking on a radio program, and she was heard by trauma health experts in California. And these are people that, it's an NGO that travels around the world going to refugee camps to try to assess the conditions for people who have been uprooted from their homes and impacted in that way. And so they agreed to come from California to spend 5 hours each of 2 days with Emilio and assess his condition. And so on Document Cloud, I think Kathy has put up this full report. And so these people are acting as assessors, not his doctors, right? So they're not making they're not prescribing a medicine for his condition, but they're saying this is what he's exhibiting. And it's very thorough, and it, suggests that he is suffering from depression, that they don't suggest a medication, but they say that he would benefit from medication, right? So this is a dramatic difference between what ICE is saying in a letter back to Congressman O'Rourke, which is that his health is okay. They mention like he's having some stomach issues, stuff like that. It's very superficial, right? No psychiatric doctor has been to visit him on the taxpayer's dime, right? So this is the first time medical professionals have been in to see him looking at this aspect. And what they found is that he's suffering and he's in need of assistance. And so now we're trying to figure out what that means. And he needs an actual doctor to visit him and prescribe something. And then we have to figure out how he gets his medication in this situation. Of course, so Attorney Beckett's solution to this is this is just another reason why he should be released, so that no harm is done to this person who, as Penny said so articulately, has committed no crime. Right? He's committed no crime.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Penny, for joining us here today. Do we have any other questions in the room? Okay. In that case, I would like to just say, yes, one more question? Is that, sorry, okay. I would just like to say we call on the U.S. government to release Emilio Gutierrez and his son, Oscar, from the detention center. They pose no flight risk. Again, we reiterate, these are people who did nothing wrong. They followed all the rules when they came to this country seeking asylum on what we feel are very, very valid grounds. So please release Emilio. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. Thank you.